The War Council droned on, a litany of troop movements and supply chain failures that beat against the stone walls of the chamber like a persistent, dreary rain. King Draven stood before the great map table, a monolith of obsidian and silver, his attention a palpable force that pinned his generals in place. For 3 centuries he had held the line against the encroaching blight from the withered lands, and his focus was as sharp and unforgiving as the shard of volcanic glass he used to mark enemy positions. The world outside this room, the world of seasons and heartbeats and fragile, fleeting lives, had long ago faded to a distant hum. Lyra stood near the hearth, the firelight catching the faint tremor in her hand as she refilled a general's goblet. She was his royal scribe, his confidant, the only human permitted within the sanctum of his strategy. For 6 years, she had been the bridge between his immortal stillness and the frantic, messy pulse of the mortal world he protected. She translated the frantic reports of dying men into the cold calculus of war he understood. But lately, the bridge felt unstable. A profound weariness had settled deep in her bones, a fatigue so heavy it felt like a shroud woven from lead. It had started weeks ago, a simple tiredness she'd attributed to the long hours, the endless stress. Now it was a constant companion, a fog that clouded her thoughts and stole the strength from her limbs. She swayed, just for a second, the clink of the pitcher against the goblet, a sound loud as a blacksmith's hammer in the tense silence. Draven's head lifted. His eyes, the color of a winter sky just before a storm, found hers across the room. There was no concern in them, only a flicker of impatient appraisal. Lyra. His voice was low, a rumble of stone on stone that commanded absolute obedience. Your hand is unsteady. She straightened, the warmth of a flush rising in her cheeks. My apologies, Your Majesty. A momentary lapse. He turned back to the map, dismissing her with a faint, almost imperceptible shake of his head. He did not mean it to be cruel, it was simply a statement of fact. She was human. Humans were creatures of fleeting strength, of inexplicable weaknesses. They slept, they sickened, they broke. It was their nature. This was just another manifestation of that inherent, frustrating fragility. See that it does not happen again, he murmured, his attention already lost to the placement of a legion near the Shadowfen Pass. Lyra's heart, which had been beating a slow, sluggish rhythm, gave a painful thud. Human frailty. He had used the phrase before, a catch-all for any mortal ailment from a common cold to a grieving heart. It was a wall he erected between his eternal, unyielding existence and her own precarious one. She had always understood it, even accepted it as part of the chasm that separated them. But tonight, the words felt like a brand, searing and unjust. This was more than frailty. This was an anchor, dragging her down into a deep, cold darkness she could not name. She retreated to her small writing desk in the corner, her quill feeling impossibly heavy. She tried to focus on the notes she was meant to be taking, but the ink blurred before her eyes. The fire in the hearth seemed to be sucking the very air from the room, leaving her breathless. A cold sweat beaded on her brow, and the relentless drumming of the general's voices became a physical pressure against her skull. She pressed her fingertips to her temples, a small, desperate gesture. One of the older generals, a man named Borin, with a face like a worn leather map, glanced at her. A brief, worried frown creased his brow before he was drawn back into the king's orbit. Draven was outlining a pincer movement, his long, elegant fingers tracing lines of death and conquest across the vellum. He was magnificent in his focus, a terrifyingly beautiful instrument of war. And he was so far away, she could have been on a different star. The darkness at the edge of her vision began to creep inward, fringed with glittering, malevolent specks of light. She knew, with a sudden, calm certainty, that she was going to fall. She tried to push back from the desk, to find the door, to escape the suffocating weight of the room, but her muscles refused to obey. The world tilted, the stone floor rushing up to meet her not with a crash, but with a soft, final sigh. Her last conscious thought was of the king's profile, silhouetted against the map, utterly unaware. The first sound that broke the chamber's spell was not her fall, which was cushioned by a thick bearskin rug, but the sharp crack of the obsidian marker as Draven snapped it in two. The abrupt violence of the sound cut through the drone of strategy. Every head turned. They saw her then, a crumpled heap of dark wool and pale skin by the hearth. For a long, suspended moment, Draven did not move. His mind, still caught in the intricate dance of war, struggled to process the image. It was an anomaly, a disruption to the ordered reality of his council. Annoyance was his first, automatic response. Another display of mortal weakness, timed for maximum distraction. He took a step, intending to order a guard to remove her, to have her seen to so that this vital work could continue. But then he saw the stillness. It was absolute. Not the gentle repose of a faint, but the profound, unnerving inertia of a puppet whose strings had been cut. Boren was already moving toward her, his old knees creaking. "Lyra!" Draven was faster. He crossed the room in two silent, fluid strides that belied his size, a predator's grace that was always so startling in its suddenness. He knelt beside her, his cool, analytical gaze sweeping over her form. Her face was ashen, her lips tinged with a faint, bruised blue. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the pulse point on her neck. It was there, but it was a frantic, thready flutter, terrified bird beating its wings against the cage of her ribs. A strange, cold feeling, unfamiliar and deeply unwelcome, slid into his gut. This was not frailty. This was a collapse. He scooped her into his arms. She was lighter than he'd imagined, a terrifying lack of substance in his unyielding embrace. Her head lolled back against his shoulder, her auburn hair spilling over the dark leather of his tunic. The scent of her, parchment, dried herbs, and something uniquely Lyra, filled his senses, a scent he had unknowingly catalogued and filed away. "The council is dismissed," he said, his voice a low command that brooked no argument. He did not look at his generals, his gaze fixed on the pale, still face nestled against his chest. They scrambled to obey, their eyes wide with a mixture of shock and fear. The king, who had not shown a flicker of personal distraction in living memory, was holding his human scribe as if she were made of spun glass. He carried her from the war room, his long strides eating up the torchlit corridors. The guards flattened themselves against the walls as he passed, their faces masks of disciplined neutrality that could not quite hide their astonishment. He moved through the cold, echoing halls of his fortress, a place built for defense and dominion, not for tenderness. Yet he held her with a strange, careful precision, as if he were carrying a declaration of peace through a battlefield. He brought her to her own chambers, a modest suite of rooms near the royal library. He laid her down on the bed, the simple wool blankets a stark contrast to the silks and velvets of his own quarters. Her breathing was shallow, a faint, rattling sound in her chest. "Send for healer Alara," he commanded the guard who had followed at a respectful distance. "Now." The guard vanished. Draven stood over the bed, a dark, looming figure in the soft candlelight. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time in weeks. He saw the faint, purple shadows under her eyes, the drawn tightness around her mouth that spoke of a pain he had refused to see. He remembered her swaying, the tremor in her hand. He remembered his own dismissive words. A momentary lapse. Human frailty. The cold feeling in his gut intensified, coiling like a serpent. It was an ancient, almost forgotten sensation. He had felt it once, long ago, when he had failed to protect his younger brother in a skirmish before his own turning. It was the icy touch of guilt, and it was terrifying. Healer Alara arrived, a gust of wind and competence. She was an old woman with eyes that had seen more than most immortals, her hands gnarled but steady. She shooed him away from the bedside without a flicker of deference. "Give me room, my lord. Panic is a poor diagnostic tool. Draven retreated to the window, his arms crossed over his chest, his posture rigid with a tension that felt like a physical cage. He watched as Alara worked, her movements efficient and practiced. She checked Lyra's pulse, her breathing, peeled back an eyelid to stare into the dilated pupil. She pressed gently on her abdomen, her brow furrowed in concentration. She uncorked small vials, wafting them under Lyra's nose, searching for a reaction that never came. Minutes stretched into an hour. The silence in the room was thick, broken only by Lyra's shallow breaths and the quiet clinking of Alara's instruments. Draven stared out at the moon-drenched courtyard, but he saw nothing. His mind was a maelstrom, replaying every moment of the past month. Lyra, paler than usual. Lyra, stifling a cough. Lyra, admitting she felt tired, only for him to wave it away with a comment about the pressures of the campaign. He had seen the signs, all of them, and he had interpreted them through the arrogant lens of his own invulnerability. He had seen a delicate flower, and, instead of tending to it, had criticized it for not being stone. "There is no fever," Alara said at last, her voice grim. "No sign of common sickness, no wound, no injury. Her body is shutting down, as if it has been instructed to do so." Draven turned from the window. Poison. The word was flat, a piece of ice in the warm room. Alara nodded slowly, her gaze drifting to the small carafe of wine on Lyra's writing desk. "It is the most likely conclusion. A slow-acting agent, something that mimics natural decline. Subtle. Cowardly." She picked up the carafe, sniffing it delicately. Her face, already grim, hardened into a mask of stone. "Ah." "What is it?" Draven's voice was sharp, a whip crack of command. The healer set the carafe down with extreme care, as if it were a live serpent. She looked at him, and for the first time, he saw a glimmer of fear in her ancient eyes. Nightshade serpent venom, distilled. A single drop in her evening wine, every night for a month. It doesn't kill with speed. It unravels the victim from the inside out, corrupting the blood, dissolving the very threads of life. There is no known antidote. The words struck Draven with the force of a physical blow. Nightshade serpent. An assassin's tool, favored by his enemies in the south. An attack. Not on him, but on her. A strike at the softest, most unprotected part of his fortress. Because they knew. They knew she was more than a scribe. They knew she was his... what? His conscience. His anchor to the world he fought for. His human heart. He strode to the bed, his mind racing through 1,000 years of accumulated knowledge, searching for a solution, a loophole, a forgotten piece of lore. There was one. One final, drastic measure. An act of creation and damnation in one. "I will turn her," he declared, his voice resonating with the absolute power of his will. The venom of his own kind was the most potent regenerative agent in existence. It could knit bones, mend flesh, purge any mortal poison. It was the answer. He reached for her, his fangs already descending, a primal protective instinct overriding all else. He would burn this poison from her veins with the fire of his own immortality. He would make her like him, unbreakable, eternal, safe. "No, my lord, wait!" Ilara's voice was sharp, desperate. She grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "You cannot!" Draven rounded on her, his eyes blazing with crimson light, a low growl rumbling in his chest. No one touched him. No one gainsaid him. "Release me, healer, or I will remove you." Ilara did not flinch. She held his gaze, her own filled with a terrible, pitying sorrow. "The poison has had weeks to work, Your Majesty." It is not merely in her blood. It has settled, nested. It has corrupted her heart. She took a deep, shuddering breath. To introduce your venom now, the two forces would not simply fight. They would merge. It would create a perversion, a creature of endless hunger and no mind. You would not save her. You would create a mindless ghoul and condemn her soul to an eternity of torment. The fire in Draven's eyes died, extinguished by a wave of cold, black horror. A ghoul. A ravenous, unthinking monster. He would be trading her quiet, gentle death for an eternal, shrieking damnation. The hand he had reached for her fell to his side, limp and useless. The fangs receded, leaving behind a bitter, metallic taste in his mouth. He stared down at Lyra's face, so peaceful in its unconsciousness, and saw it twisted into a mindless snarl. He imagined her eyes, the warm, intelligent brown eyes that had so often met his with understanding, turned into vacant pits of need. The image was so vile, so unbearable, that it broke something inside him. The centuries of control, of emotional distance, of kingly composure shattered into a million pieces. He sank to his knees beside the bed, his head bowed. The full weight of his failure crashed down upon him. He had been so absorbed in his war, in his grand strategies and immortal concerns, that he had failed to see the assassin creeping into his own home. He had ignored her weakness, dismissed her pain, and in doing so, he had personally delivered her into the hands of her killer. Her blood was on his hands, not the assassin's. The poison was in her veins, but the guilt was in his. It was a toxin far more potent, burning through his soul with an agony he had not felt since the day he'd lost the sun. He stayed there for a long time, kneeling on the cold stone floor, the silence of the room a testament to his impotence. Elara watched him, her expression a mixture of pity and professional concern. She knew there was nothing more she could do. The greatest medical minds could not fight this poison. The king's own potent biology was not a cure, but a catalyst for something worse. Lyra was lost. But Draven was not a being who accepted defeat. He had waged wars against impossible odds, held back tides of darkness that should have consumed the world. He refused to let this be the end. If known magic and medicine had failed, he would turn to the unknown, to the forbidden. He rose to his feet, his face a mask of terrible resolve. "Leave us," he said to Elara, his voice raspy. "My lord, there is nothing." "Leave us!" The command was absolute, imbued with the full weight of his ancient power. The very air in the room grew heavy, pressing down. Elara bowed her head, her shoulders slumping in defeat, and quietly let herself out, closing the heavy oak door behind her. Alone, Draven walked to the hearth. He stared into the flames, the light dancing across the hard planes of his face. There was one last path, a ritual so ancient and dangerous it was spoken of only in whispers, recorded only in the most proscribed texts, hidden in the deepest vaults of his library. The sanguine accipere, the blood rite. It was a blasphemy against the laws of nature, a fool's bargain that risked 2 souls for the chance of saving one. It involved the weaving of life forces, a direct, unfiltered connection between 2 beings. Through that link, one could, in theory, take on the afflictions of another. One could draw poison from a mortal body into an immortal one. The risks were astronomical. For the mortal, the sheer force of an immortal's life essence could shatter their mind or stop their heart. For the immortal, introducing a lethal mortal toxin into their perfect, unchanging system was an act of profound self-destruction. The pain would be unimaginable, a torment that could last for days, weeks even. It could permanently weaken him, leave him scarred in ways no physical wound ever could. It might even kill him. Immortals could be killed, it was simply very, very difficult. This was one of the few ways. He looked back at Lyra, he saw her smile, a rare and precious thing she usually saved for the moments when she thought he wasn't looking. He heard her voice, a low, steady counterpoint to his own harsh commands. He felt the quiet, unassuming strength of her presence, a warmth he had taken for granted like the heat from this fire. To lose that, to lose her, because of his arrogance and neglect, was a fate worse than any physical torment the right could inflict. The decision was not a decision at all. It was a certainty. He would walk through fire for her. He would drink poison for her. He would tear down the laws of magic and nature with his bare hands if it meant she would open her eyes again. He went to his own chambers and retrieved the grim, iron-bound book from its hidden compartment behind a loose stone in the wall. The leather was cold and brittle to the touch. He carried it back to her room, the weight of it a sin in his hands. He laid it on her writing desk, pushing aside the neat stacks of her papers, the half-finished letter to her sister, the small, pressed flowers she used as a bookmark. Each item was a fresh stab of guilt. He opened the book. The pages were vellum, made from the skin of some forgotten creature, the ink a rusty, dried blood brown. The script was in a long, dead tongue, but he read it as easily as his own name. The ritual was complex, requiring absolute focus, immense power, and a willingness to embrace agony. He traced the diagram, a circle of intertwined runes connecting two figures, a circle of shared fate. His preparations were methodical, each action steeped in a grim, silent purpose. He cleared the center of the room, rolling back the thick carpets to expose the cold, gray flagstones. Using a piece of chalk from Lyra's desk, he began to draw the complex runic circle on the floor, his movements precise and economical. The ancient symbols glowed with a faint, sickly light as he completed them, the air in the room growing thick and still, charged with a potent, volatile magic. He found a silver ritual knife in a chest at the foot of her bed, a relic she used for cutting bookbinding thread, its edge still keen. He took 2 silver goblets from a nearby tray. He then returned to her bedside and gently, carefully lifted her from the bed. She was a dead weight in his arms, her body limp, her skin clammy and cold. He carried her to the center of the circle and laid her down, her head pillowed on his own folded cloak. He knelt opposite her, the two of them forming the focal points of the forbidden geometry he had drawn. He looked at her face, tracing the curve of her cheekbone with his gaze. I failed you, he thought, the admission a raw, open wound in his mind. I saw you fading, and I called it frailty. Let this pain be my penance. Let it be enough. He took a deep breath, steeling himself. He held the silver knife over his own palm, the metal cool against his skin. With a single decisive motion, he drew the blade across his flesh. The cut was deep. Blood, dark and rich as liquid rubies, welled up instantly. It did not drip. His preternatural flesh was already trying to heal, the edges of the wound knitting together. He had to concentrate, to force it to remain open, a violation of his very nature. He held his bleeding palm over one of the silver goblets, letting it fill. Then he turned to her. This was the part he dreaded most. He took her hand, so small and cold in his. Her skin was fragile, the blue veins a delicate map beneath the surface. He hesitated for only a heartbeat, his own pain a distant echo compared to the thought of marking her perfect skin. But there was no other way. With infinite gentleness, he made a tiny, shallow incision on the inside of her wrist. Her blood, when it came, was sluggish and dark, almost black, tainted by the venom. He let a few drops fall into the second goblet. He placed the goblets on their designated runes within the circle. Then he took her hand again, pressing his bleeding palm against her wrist, wound to wound. He closed his eyes and began to chant, the ancient words a low, guttural vibration that originated deep in his chest. The runes on the floor flared, casting the room in an eerie, pulsating crimson light. He felt the connection snap into place. It was not a gentle joining. It was a violent collision of two vastly different realities. Her life force was a flickering candle, guttering in a storm. His was a bonfire, an inferno of ancient power. He had to shield her from the full force of it, banking his own fires, wrapping his essence around her fragile flame, protecting it from being extinguished by his own overwhelming presence. And then he pulled. It was the single most painful sensation of his 1,000-year existence. The poison did not simply enter his body, it tore its way in. He felt it leave her wrist and surge up his arm, a river of molten glass and razor blades. His immortal blood, pure and unchanging for centuries, recoiled. It was a violation on a cellular level, a corruption of his very being. A scream ripped through him, but it was silent, trapped within the confines of his own mind. His body convulsed, every muscle locking in a spasm of pure agony. Black veins erupted along his arm, a visible map of the poison's path as it snaked its way toward his heart. The burning was indescribable, a chemical fire that fed on his vitality. He could feel it attacking his tissues, his organs, his ancient, powerful heart. His body, which could heal from any mortal wound in seconds, was at war with itself. One part tried to expel the toxin, while the other, commanded by his iron will, held the channel open, drawing more of it in. He was the filter. His body was the crucible. He pulled the tainted blood from her, circulated it through his own system, where his immense vitality fought and neutralized the venom, particle by particle. And then he pushed his own pure, life-giving blood back into her. It was a slow, torturous exchange. A single drop of her blood for a single drop of his. He gritted his teeth, sweat beading on his brow and turning to steam in the cold air. The room spun around him, the crimson light of the runes blurring into a bloody haze. He was locked in a battle on two fronts, the war against the poison raging inside him, and the delicate, focused effort of keeping the connection to Lyra stable, of cleansing her without overwhelming her. Hours bled into one another. Time lost all meaning, becoming a fluid, elastic thing measured only in waves of agony. He felt the venom work its way through his entire system. It felt like his bones were being ground to dust, his muscles shredded. Hallucinations flickered at the edge of his vision, battles from centuries past, the faces of long-dead enemies, the blinding light of the sun on his human skin. He clung to a single, anchoring image, Lyra's face. He focused on the faint, steadying rhythm of her heartbeat, now slowly strengthening as his own life force poured into her. That was his lodestar in a sea of pain. He could feel the subtle shift in the balance. The blood he drew from her was becoming cleaner, the dark, sluggish quality giving way to a healthier, brighter red. The poison was consolidating within him, a concentrated core of torment. He had taken it all. It was his now. His to endure, his to conquer. He pushed one last wave of pure, untainted blood into her veins. He felt her heartbeat kick, stronger now, steadier. The flickering candle had become a steady flame. He had done it. The knowledge brought no triumph, only a sliver of relief in the vast ocean of his suffering. With the last of his strength, he severed the connection. The crimson light of the runes died, plunging the room back into the soft gloom of candlelight. The sudden silence was deafening. The strength that had sustained him through the ordeal vanished. His body, no longer held together by sheer force of will, gave out completely. He slumped forward, his head hitting the cold stone floor with a dull thud. His vision swam with black spots. The pain was still there, a roaring inferno in his veins, but it was distant now, muffled by a profound, crushing exhaustion unlike anything he had ever known. He had faced down armies, slain mythical beasts, and bent nations to his will. But this silent, internal battle had taken more from him than all of them combined. He was empty. He lay there on the floor of her chamber, a fallen king in a circle of his own making, his breathing ragged. He had drawn the poison from her heart and locked it within his own. He did not know if his body could overcome it. He did not, in that moment, care. He had given her back her life. It was enough. His last conscious thought was the sound of her breathing, a soft, even rhythm in the quiet room. It was the most beautiful sound in the world. Consciousness returned, not as a gentle dawn, but as a slow, reluctant crawl from a deep, dreamless abyss. Lyra's first sensation was one of profound peace. The crushing weight that had pressed down on her for weeks was gone. The fog in her mind had lifted, leaving behind a crystalline clarity. She took a breath, a real, deep breath that filled her lungs completely, and it felt like a miracle. She felt well, better than well. She felt vibrant, alive, every nerve ending humming with a quiet, unfamiliar energy. She opened her eyes. The ceiling of her chamber was cast in the soft, gray light of early morning. She turned her head, a simple movement that a day ago would have been an exhausting effort. And then she saw him. The sight stole the miraculous breath from her lungs. King Draven was slumped on the floor beside her bed, his head and shoulders propped against the mattress, his long limbs sprawled at an awkward angle. The formidable, unassailable monarch who dominated every room he entered was a study in ruin. His silver-streaked black hair was matted with sweat and clung to his temples. His face, usually a mask of regal severity, was pale as bone china, etched with lines of exhaustion and pain she had never seen before. A dark, jagged pattern of veins, like black lightning, was visible on his neck and hands, stark, terrifying mar against his pallid skin. His fine tunic was rumpled and stained, and his breathing was a shallow, ragged sound in the stillness. He was not asleep. His eyes were open, fixed on her, though the usual piercing intensity was gone, replaced by a dull, feverish glaze. He looked utterly broken. The sheer, shocking vulnerability of him was more frightening than his power had ever been. "You're awake," he rasped, and his voice, that deep, commanding rumble, was a dry, cracked whisper. The effort of speaking seemed to cost him dearly. Lyra pushed herself up, her own strength surprising her. The room was cold. She saw the strange, faded chalk circle on the floor, the 2 silver goblets, one overturned. A faint, coppery scent hung in the air. None of it made sense. Her mind, clear as it was, held no memory of how she had gotten here. She only remembered the war council, the suffocating feeling, the world tilting. What happened?" she asked, her own voice sounding strange in her ears, strong and clear. Draven tried to push himself up, to regain some semblance of his usual imposing posture, but a tremor ran through his arm, and he sank back against the bed with a low, involuntary groan of pain. The sound, so utterly human, so unlike him, sent a jolt of alarm through her. "There was an incident," he said, forcing the words out. "You were unwell." "I was poisoned," she said, the word coming to her with sudden, chilling certainty. She remembered the healer's grave face, a fleeting image from the edge of consciousness. "Elara, she said there was no antidote." Draven's gaze flickered away toward the window. He could not meet her eyes. She was mistaken. It was then that she noticed his hand, resting on the floor near hers. The palm was marred by a deep, vicious-looking cut that was sluggishly, imperfectly healing, and on her own wrist, a tiny corresponding mark. She reached out, her fingers hovering over the back of his hand. His skin, usually cool as marble, radiated a dry, intense heat. He was burning with fever. The door creaked open and healer Alara entered, her face a mixture of anxiety and disbelief. She carried a tray with a steaming bowl and a cup. Her eyes went from Lyra, sitting up and clear-eyed, to the broken king on the floor, and a gasp escaped her lips. "By the gods," she whispered, rushing forward. She knelt beside Draven, ignoring Lyra for the moment. "Your Majesty, what have you done?" She gently touched his forehead, her professional calm overriding her shock. "He's burning. The poison, it's in him." Her gaze snapped to Lyra, wide with dawning, horrified comprehension. "The sanguine Axipir. He performed the blood rite. That old madness. I never thought—" Lyra stared at the healer, the impossible words slowly sinking in. The blood rite. She had read of it in the most forbidden of the library's texts. A myth. A suicide pact disguised as a healing ritual. A way to transfer an ailment, poison, a curse, from one person to another by linking their very life force. It was a legend used to frighten aspiring mages. A cautionary tale about the price of meddling with the fundamentals of life and death. She looked at her own healthy skin, felt the strong, steady beat of her own heart. Then she looked at Draven, at the black veins marring his flesh, at the agony clouding his eyes, at the fever that was consuming his immortal frame. He had taken it. He had taken the poison from her and drawn it into himself. The cold, distant king, who had dismissed her fatigue as mere human frailty, had willingly embraced an agony that would kill a mortal 10 times over, just to save her. A wave of emotion so powerful it made her dizzy washed over her. It was a tidal wave of horror, of gratitude, of a deep, aching tenderness that was almost painful. "Why?" she whispered, the question directed at him. Draven finally met her gaze. The feverish haze in his eyes sharpened for a moment, and in their depths she saw it all. The crushing guilt, the terror of losing her, the grim, unshakable resolve. "It was my failing," he said, his voice barely audible. "I saw, I did not see. The debt was mine to pay." He sagged then, his consciousness finally giving way to the overwhelming strain. His eyes fluttered closed, his head slumping to the side. "Help me get him to his bed," Alara said, her voice tight with urgency. "His body is fighting a war. We can only hope it is strong enough to win." For the next 6 days, their roles were utterly reversed. Lyra became the tireless caretaker, Draven the helpless patient. The great king, who had not known a moment of sickness in 1,000 years, was laid low. He was trapped in a delirium, tossing and turning in his vast, cold bed, muttering of forgotten battles and calling out names she did not know. The black veins spread, a spiderweb of corruption across his skin, before slowly, painstakingly, beginning to recede as his powerful immortal constitution waged its slow, brutal war against the serpent's venom. Lyra never left his side. She bathed his feverish brow with cool cloths. She helped Alara force broths and healing draughts between his clenched teeth. She sat for hours, watching the shallow rise and fall of his chest, her hand resting on his, a silent, constant presence. In his delirium, he would sometimes grasp her hand, his grip surprisingly strong, as if she were his only anchor in a storm-tossed sea. She saw him stripped of all his power, all his regal authority. She saw the man beneath the crown, a being of immense strength, but also, she now knew, of immense, deeply buried feeling. The wall of his immortality had crumbled, and in its place was a raw, terrifying vulnerability. And she found that she did not fear it. She wanted only to protect it. On the 7th day, the fever broke. He woke in the dead of night, his mind clear for the first time. His eyes, no longer hazed with pain, found her immediately. She was asleep in a chair beside his bed, her head resting on her arms. He watched her for a long time, the moonlight tracing the peaceful lines of her face. The last of the poison was a dull, aching echo in his bones, a reminder of the price he had paid, a price he would pay 1,000 times over. He shifted, the rustle of the sheets waking her. She sat up, blinking the sleep from her eyes. "You're awake," she said, a wave of relief washing over her face, making her radiant in the moonlight. "I am," he confirmed. His voice was still weak, but it was his own. A comfortable silence settled between them, no longer a chasm of unspoken things, but a shared space of understanding. He had never felt so exposed, so utterly transparent before anyone. And yet, looking at the gentle concern in her eyes, he felt no shame. A tickle started in her nose. It was a perfectly ordinary, mundane sensation. She tried to stifle it, not wanting to disturb the quiet moment. But it was insistent. She turned her head away and let out a small, quiet sneeze. Instantly, Draven was trying to sit up, his eyes wide with alarm. "Are you all right?" The question was sharp, filled with a primal panic that was utterly disproportionate to the event. "Is it your lungs? Does your head ache?" "Alara!" Lyra stared at him, bewildered. "It was just a sneeze." "A sneeze can be a symptom," he insisted, his voice gaining strength from sheer, unadulterated anxiety. He looked her over as if expecting her to collapse on the spot. "Are you cold? Do you require another blanket? Perhaps a tonic?" She couldn't help it. A small smile touched her lips. "Draven," she said, her voice soft. "I am fine, truly. You saved me. I am well." He sank back against the pillows, though his eyes never left her, still filled with a deep, lingering worry. He had pulled her back from the brink of death, but the terror of almost losing her had not receded with the poison. It had settled in his heart, a permanent, watchful sentinel. And so it began, the first of a century of such questions. The war with the withered lands was won. Peace settled over the kingdom, a quiet, growing thing. Lyra remained by his side, no longer just a scribe, but his queen, his partner in all things. Their love was a quiet, unspoken treaty, forged in fire and poison and sealed with a shared, terrible memory. But the king was a changed man. The century that followed was marked by his relentless, often comical, vigilance over her health. If she coughed at a state dinner, the entire hall would fall silent as the king's piercing gaze fixed on her, demanding a full report on her condition. If she stumbled on a loose cobblestone in the garden, he would materialize at her side in a blur of motion, his hands hovering, ready to catch her, his face a mask of apocalyptic concern. He had healers develop a dozen different tonics for general well-being, which he insisted she take daily. He had the royal seamstresses craft her cloaks with triple linings, convinced she was perpetually on the verge of catching a chill, even in the height of summer. "My love," she would say, laughing, as he wrapped another blanket around her shoulders while she sat reading by a roaring fire. "I am not made of glass." He would not smile, but the hard lines around his eyes would soften. He would touch her cheek, his fingers gentle, his gaze tracing her features as if to reassure himself she was still there, solid and real. "No," he would agree, his voice a low, serious rumble. "You are not. But glass can be replaced." One evening, decades into their reign, they were walking along the castle battlements, watching the sunset. A cool breeze swept past and Lyra shivered, a simple, reflexive action. Immediately he was shrugging off his own heavy cloak and draping it over her shoulders, his movements swift and practiced. She stopped and turned to face him, pulling the warm, heavy fabric tighter around herself. She looked up into his face, into the winter sky eyes that now, after so long, she could read as easily as any book. The worry was still there, a permanent shadow in their depths. "You never stop, do you?" she asked, her voice gentle. "Stop what?" "Worrying. Every time I sneeze, every time I cough, I see that look on your face. The same look you had when I woke up in that room." He looked away, out over the peaceful, darkening lands. His profile was as sharp and regal as ever, but she knew the turmoil that still churned beneath the surface. "I remember what it felt like," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of all its kingly resonance. "To feel you fading. To know that I was the cause. That I was too blind, too arrogant to see what was right in front of me." He finally looked at her, his gaze raw with the memory. "The poison is gone from my veins, Lyra. But the fear of it, the fear of my own failure, I do not think that will ever leave me." She reached up and cupped his face in her hands, her thumbs stroking the high, sharp cheekbones. "You didn't fail, Draven. You saved me. You walked through hell for me." "And I would do it again," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I would burn for eternity if it meant you were safe." "I know," she whispered. "But I am safe. I am here." She leaned in and pressed her lips to his, a soft, reassuring kiss. "And I am not going anywhere." He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. His own hands came up to cover hers, holding them against his face. For a long moment, he just breathed, anchoring himself to her presence. The next day, as they were reviewing trade manifests in the library, she felt the familiar tickle in her nose. She tried to suppress it, but it was no use. She let out a loud, un-Lademan-like sneeze. Every head in the library snapped up. Scribes dropped their quills, pages froze mid-turn. And King Draven, from his seat at the head of the great table, was already on his feet, his face a perfect picture of catastrophic alarm. "Are you all right?" he demanded, his voice echoing in the sudden, tomb-like silence. Lyra looked at him, at the terrifying, all-powerful, 1,000-year-old monarch who was ready to bring the full force of the kingdom to bear on a single sneeze. And she laughed, a sound of pure, unadulterated love. "Yes, my dear, overprotective king," she said, smiling at him across the table. "I am perfectly okay." He stared at her for a long moment, his panic slowly receding, replaced by a familiar, grudging acceptance. He gave a stiff, formal nod, as if acknowledging a diplomatic